third tip, of course, is secure funding. Not necessarily just VC funding, grant funding. I mean, again, in Europe, finally, we start to have a full-fledged curve where you start from lab research. And again, universities and corporates can be extremely helpful. Like I said, we backed spinouts that were formal spinouts where they went through the whole process. They took advantage of the accelerators, incubators in the universities, and the universities have a stake. And everybody's happy. We all agree that it was a fair deal. So you can actually take advantage from funding through the institution that you're coming from. You then, of course, have venture capital funds of different sizes. We tend to be a first check investor, so we normally write either a safe at the very pre-seed stage or come together as larger rounds but still at seed stage. But then you have larger funds like IQ, Eastward, but bigger names that might write much bigger tickets slightly later on in the journey. And then, of course, the chain continues. And as it goes on, you start to be able to tap into traditional investors because, of course, once you go past, let's say, the Series A-ish level, obviously it's just the branding, but just to give you an idea, then realistically, you've de-risked a lot of the tech development R&D risk. So a lot of investors that might not normally look at advanced technologies may decide to start doing it. And of course, these days for AI is a lot simpler because who is not an AI investor if you look at Twitter or LinkedIn? But that's a different story. Who is not an AI company also by that same token? Again, another different story. But a lot of grants as well. I was chatting to one investor in our fund the other day, and I was actually making the case that backing spinouts is becoming less of a burden for early investors with the smaller funds because of grants. In the last company we backed, the full round ended up being 4 million. They concurrently raised, bit before, bit after, and concurrently, just about the same from European grants mostly and Innovate UK. So again, there is further funding you can access, and it's becoming easier and easier. Plus, if you're spinning out, you're probably used to writing internal papers and whatever, and that's the boring part of getting public funding. So, you might already be trained for it. And then, of course, fourth and tip is assemble a great team. This is a point that is actually probably the most critical. There is, last one later, but the fourth tip is probably the most important. The most important because most people don't think about it until it's too late. When assemble a great team, of course, the top part that is you see there, skills, technical, business, great, right? That's fairly a given. The bottom part is what you really need to focus on. 90% of the no's I say early on when I'm about to invest, besides the fact that I'm a moron and I might not see a great company in front of me, right? Everybody makes mistakes, is because a lot of people think too much about commercializing an IP and very little about building a company that is going to sustain. BioNTech might have started as a company that makes vaccine or whatever. The reality is that the vaccine is only one product. Their platform is doing a lot more on mRNA, right? And that company has got expertise, and from the early days, they were about building something a lot bigger than just creating a vaccine. And so that is the mindset you need to have. So if there is just one thing you take away from today, it's that whatever you do, well, two things. One, always think ahead and have those early conversations with people down the line in the food chain that's going to give you more negotiation power. That's why I spend some more time on the first slide on the tips. And then this one, just don't think, there isn't like a straightforward thing, but have this idea in mind that you're not just commercializing IP. That's the easy part in a way. You're building, if you want to commercialize IP, you've got to build a company that supports that. And building a company is actually a completely different thing. Obviously I'm a next computer scientist, so I think in math terms, building a company is a bigger set that includes commercializing the IP. The commercializing IP is part of the journey. But it's not the other way around. Commercializing IP is a subset of building a company. You've got to think bigger than just taking that idea or tech to market. And for that, you need a team and you need support. And that's what I'm saying. You need to spend equal time between thinking about go-to-market and everything you read in startup books and whatever, as well as what is the company that is going to be best suited to commercialize this IP. And when you're very early on, it happens that you've got some holes. The best thing you can do when you've got some holes is to be upfront about it, to realize whether it's actually something you can get people to help you fill. I remember again one of the first investments we made up, as a fund rather than as an angel investor, was a company that told me, I have no idea how to scale the team. We've got until here, it was just spun out now, but we're 23 and 24, and we think we're the best in the world at building this technology. we need a CEO. That was actually fine. The fact that they realized their shortcoming, and through the round, actually they had a couple of candidates that through our money, they hired eventually one of them to be the CEO, was actually a sign of strength. Somebody that recognized a weakness, that there was like a missing piece for the company to be a great company, having already got everything else to commercialize the AP, was actually a great sign of strength. And so don't necessarily think that you've got to hide, your skeletons. In some cases, it's actually best to just be upfront about what you lack, because either your TTO, follow-on investors, partners, lawyers, can help you fill that hole. And then lastly, leverage your network. To do all of these things, you've got to have to speak to people. And it's becoming easier now because we're not locked into a room with a Zoom in front of us, right? We can touch each other, and, we exist. There are events like this. There are meetups all over. There are, of course, universities starting to finally do some drinks for their alumni and trying, and it's not necessarily all the same for all universities, but there are support groups. If not, you can again get the support of your partners, whether it's follow-on investors, whether it's lawyers. Again, I said it before, right? Try to leverage the people that might have a vested interest in supporting you. And some people might not have time and bandwidth today, but they might have tomorrow. And others might. Again, it's a numbers game, right? You're gonna have to try to put yourself out there, but through that network, you're gonna be able to create this snowball effect where it might start small, but it gets bigger and bigger the more people you get to support the development of it. In fact, I would say, even though there is all this potential challenge in spinning out, to go from lab to market might actually be easier once you go past these hurdles. And here's why. Everybody else in the world building a company, especially in the applied tech scenario, will have to struggle to find the famous product market fit and building the tech and everything around that. If you've already got IP that it potentially gets interest from future corporates, investors, whatever, you might actually be ahead of the game, not even having a company. And so even though it's challenging, you might actually treasure the fact that spinning out going from lab to market gives you an edge, because you can already show something and validate something before you actually go and build the company. That can be your greatest asset. When you go to speak to people, you don't just have an idea, you've got something to commercialize. And so leveraging your network is something you can do also as a function of the fact that you've got something to show. And that's all, folks. So as a reminder, again, remember sort of key takeaways. Europe is actually a flourishing ground for innovation. We've got a lot of potential. That potential also comes with some challenges. Those challenges, though, can be offset by the potential, which is really immense. If we talk about technologies that finally have a food chain to get invested all the way down to IPO. And those technologies can solve huge problems. Again, we're not just talking about, a scooter to go around in mobility style, but actually fusion, AI, semiconductors, these type of technologies that can help us literally propel ourselves into the future. So it's worth, in a way, fighting for. And that's probably the last message from this presentation. And then again, we've got 15 minutes for questions. Please grill me. But it is that, yes, there are challenges, but you're not alone. We're all fighting to make the system better on. Investors are fighting. Other startup founders are fighting. You will be fighting. And the more we do this, the more we get better. The more we teach universities, the more we teach corporates how to do it properly. And so, ultimately, I believe the fight is worth. And if you also believe the same, then there you go. Let's go make some spinouts happen. Thank you very much. Please start off questions. Yes?
How is it rising funds in a market where the base rate is so high, much higher than it was 6 months ago?
How is it to rise funds? Very, very shitty. It's very difficult. But if you genuinely believe in it, again, by the way, as a VC fund, I also need to raise, right? So we're all raising. But it's but you then get the opposite, right? Everything has a give and take. So the flip side of that is that in an environment where interest rates are so high, the applied tech, let's say vanilla software companies, whatever, that might even have gone public at insanely high valuations have now collapsed. And then you've got anomalies like Nvidia that are rising, right? And people are starting to know this stuff. So again, it's difficult. But you can point out to the fact that if you're commercializing genuinely disruptive IP or investing in, then you might tell people, hey, think about 10, 12 years down the line. Would you prefer to be one of the investors that backed gorillas, or would you prefer to be a founder that has built NVIDIA, right? And I think that's a powerful message. It helps. It's still a shitty market. Yes.
As an investor, are you focused on specific spaces or applications?
I mean, personally, yeah. I mean, I tend to focus on the future of computing. So our last investment was a semiconductor company, as well as climate hardware mostly, and defense. But of course, we're about to close a health tech company that is on the software space using ML for biomarker detection. So the reality is that I'm personally interested in novel technologies. Yes, I do have kind of a theme, and that's another thing. You can also try and figure out from websites and LinkedIn's and Twitter's what investors are mostly focused on, because of course people have different mandates and different things, and finding somebody and you can check on Crunchbase, by the way, if anybody here, I don't know if you've used it, but you can check what companies people have invested in. That can give you again a leverage into say, hey, I decided to do this spinout, I saw you invested in similar companies, let's have a chat. It's a much more likely conversation to happen. I don't know why people are still flying at me like Web3 projects, but I never invested in one so far, but people still do. It's a waste of their time, it's a waste of my time. But if somebody say, hey, I'm building a battery recycling technology company, yeah, when can we have coffee? So yes, people have teams, and you could look at past investments to figure out what they are. Yes?
Hi, what your advice would be for multi-center, multi-university studies? I'm coming from AI in medicine, and we conduct multi-center studies all around the world with many universities, and are really, really familiarized with what you said about IP and royalties and stuff, because universities tend to fight it with each other and fight with us as well. Who's going to get hold of the IP? Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? And it is a really problematic era. And so the question is, what your advice would be a good course of action to deal with them?
It's actually like probably the worst situation when you have multiple players to deal with from the ground up, because you're right, they're going to fight each other and they're going to fight you, and then it's like nobody agrees. And the confusion is bigger of a problem than the actual intention. The course of actions. Well, the first thing is to try to figure out what's the preference in terms of what is the sort of highest claim to the research. If there is a leading institution or leading person or a concentration of IP, then that can be a good start, because at least it starts to give an order of importance to people. Another thing you can do is to figure out if there is any ancillary IP that is not critical, so the worst case you're prepared to lose. Again, in some example, it wasn't exactly this case, but we had a case where a person contributed to the IP and had some claim, and they couldn't figure out how to get the person on board. Eventually, last minute they did, but they had a backup plan by that point. So that worst case scenario they had decided that they could rebuild that part of the IP differently, so not to infringe a claim against that person, or that person couldn't claim again. So I would say these two are first things you can think of. The last one is to try and figure out if there is any connection or network. So if these universities have come together because of a consortium, because of a grant, because of a program, or at least a good part of it, then potentially those people have good relationships with all of them to try and set up an open discussion, a roundtable. And I think, these top three things, but ultimately will come down to have one, knowing who will be the negotiating parties, and two, getting them to agree to something that is fair. Or you get Mershkan Ray or anybody else in the law team to just fight them all the way until the death.
Thank you.
Yes?
You mentioned grants earlier, and especially from the EU. I'm just wondering if you have any practical tips on navigating this, I'd say, fairly complex process of finding the right grants and then also applying for them?
I wish I had.
Okay.
No, literally there isn't a straightforward path. There are some consultants that help taking a fee. I don't have any view on how one or the other might be good or bad. Normally it's just just trying, basically. And I guess attending events, that's a good thing. So they're doing workshops and online webinars. Innovate UK is doing it, European Innovation Council is doing it. So trying to basically familiarize yourself with that. And well, there is one thing you could do. So normally those grants rely on judges and people. Some of them will reply if you connect to them on LinkedIn and ask them questions. That could also be helpful to find someone that is willing to have a chat or just an exchange of emails, and they are linked to that organization, because it's not just internal people, right? Most of the time they rely on third parties that support, and those committees in some cases have people that are willing to just separately help. That could be another thing.
Thank you.
That's right. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah. So just from the perspective of yourself as an investor, and I just want to verify some of my understanding previously. So you mentioned having IP, and you spoke about a previous company that had their IP on an open market basis, so they were open source, I guess. How attractive is that to an investing business when your core product is an open source solution, but then your additional services and everything else that's containerized within the company, and that's IP of that business?
Good point. There has to be a balance, right? So there's nothing against the company basing their tech on open research, papers that have been published and everybody can read and use, or open source, of course, technology, as long as you have evidence that you are either building something on top that is kept secret, or through the network that you started to create and the traction you have, you've been able to do something with that IP. Of course, the less IP you have, the more it's about effectively being like a traditional tech company where you're actually showing some kind of traction or support. The more IP you have, the more you might have investors that believe the same way that you do, that IP is worth something. So again, it's a balance. In my personal experience, I think everybody always had some, at least trade secret, maybe not filed patents yet, but patents they intended to file separately from the open, published research. That's been personal experience. Again, there is a spectrum.
Does it make any difference if the company that's offering the platform is also the same company that controlled the sort of development of the project?
No, I think it's fine.
If you have the IP sort of tied into the business.
Yeah, I mean, it's just different options, but nothing specific against one way or another.
Okay, thank you.
That's right. Any other questions? Go last 5. Yeah, go for it.
It seems that this talk has a lot of value to speak to universities and integrators.
Yeah.
And if you're doing something similar at Oxford or Cambridge, the actual spinout unit, to learn best practices.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be open for it. I haven't done one yet. But yeah, sure, why not? Great, nice one. And you were going to ask something?
Yes. It's more a curiosity than a question.
Sure.
What is the balance you see in the evolution of the company between getting grants funding and the capital and money from the clients, which basically means start generating turnover and in the end profits?
I mean, the reality is there isn't a straightforward answer. As in, for instance, we've backed a company that was like unable to generate genuine revenue besides grants and co-development project for when we backed them for at least a couple of years. Now we're coming to the end of the 2 years, and things are going well. But we knew that was the game. There is another company that we recently backed that again is also developing AP, but I managed to pre-book revenue, so they've got orders that are piling up, and they're going to ship their AP again next year. But the product, but they've managed to get clients to not just give a letter of intent, but an actual purchase order. The reality is that it depends on the application. Of course, the more the merrier, but I've seen companies get funded, and I've funded companies in both cases. So I guess in a nutshell, it depends on the market. For instance, if you are in battery components for EV, vehicles market, it's fairly standard that gigafactories will not pay you for a pilot. And so if a company says, well, we've got this letter of intent for, Samsung or whatever, or like Norfolk, then to me it's got a lot of value because I know that they're not going to pay you for that type of pilot. There are other areas, like if you're building a hardware device or if you're building a software even based on AI, where there's nothing stopping you from monetizing your MVP. And so if you don't have some revenues or at least some customers that have pre-ordered, then you've got a bit of a weaker hand because nothing really stops you. Other people have done it. So you see what I'm saying? It depends, I guess, a lot on the market and what's common practice in the market.
It's very subjective and it
Yeah.
depends on the capital intensity of
Yeah, and you can find out, what is the usual practice, where are the normal customers, what do they normally do, either from other founders or just from, people in the market, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right. Yes?
Quick one. What are the ideas or spinouts that you find most exciting now?
Oh. I don't know. What do we find most exciting in Silicon? Personally, like I said, anything that falls into the sort of three key themes that I'm currently very bullish on. I think computing demand is becoming unsustainable. AI is just accelerating a process that was already there. So anything that can help the infrastructure get better, literally at semiconductor level is interesting. It's just one. But then on climate, we can't claim to solve climate challenges if we keep backing carbon credits companies, because of course you can credit all you want, but eventually somebody's going to have to do a physical system to take carbon out of the atmosphere or give us alternative sources of storage or production of energy. I'm also bullish on defense. I think Ukraine shows that Europe was thoroughly unprepared, and in the US, for instance, they've been using dual-use technologies, and the government has backed technologies that can be commercialized to people, and people use it, from the Microsofts or whatever. But then the government can also use, and Palantir is only one famous example, but there are many others. And so I think now people have woken up to the idea that some technologies do matter for critical situations, and having that dual use might just give you an edge, because you might have great customers in the commercial space, but you might also have Lockheed Martin giving you a 10 million contract because they know that in the future they might need you. But that's just my personal view. I also think biotech right now is huge. I personally would do very little because it's a very niche market. Unless it's tech bio, then platform level. But again, I think anything to do with infrastructure technology, even that goes beyond what my little fund can do, is extremely exciting these days. Last minutes. Do we have one more question? There we go.
I just thought, the companies you are sort of speaking to, are they considering global expansion as part of their plans, or is it too early at this stage?
Actually, there is a very specific data point I can give you. So we run a survey in our community, so even bigger than the portfolio company, from companies that secure venture funding from, let's say, C to B. That's the most responses we got. And there was one thing that stood out, because there was a fairly open question on